Good day once more. This is lecture 13, and we are going on to the topic of the Enlightenment movement. The Enlightenment movement is a movement that for a number of philosophers has not yet ended. Sometimes we talk about our society as a post-Enlightenment society, and very often when we talk about postmodernism, that's precisely what we are talking about, because very closely associated with the notion of the Enlightenment is the notion of modernism. And I will be discussing in this series of lectures, the next 4 lectures, precisely what modernism is all about. Now we can go back to the time of Descartes and Spinoza and Locke and Bacon and recognize the birth of a new civilization, the Renaissance, the initiation of what is called the Age of Reason, where philosophers, still within the ambit of a Christian civilization and a Christian culture, were discussing issues, philosophical issues that have implications for Christian theology, but not resorting to the strategies and the intellectual devices of medieval theologians. They were using their arguments based purely on reason. And this new civilization and culture really flourished and blossomed in the early 18th century. And to a large extent, humanity felt and recognized that they had really made strides in terms of the progress of civilization. They had made significant strides. There were a number of historical developments that served as the material foundation for that new kind of philosophical understanding of the world and insight into things. And the age came to be recognized as an entirely distinct period in human history. And that is what we refer to as the Enlightenment period, the Age of Enlightenment. Sometimes also referred to as the Age of Ideology, because we're going to recognize that, in a sense, ideology was born at that time. These great thinkers were ideologues, and they generated systems of thought that, even though those systems of thought encountered serious criticism from fellow philosophers, yet had a tremendous impact on the way in which we view reality and the way in which we perceive the world. Now, what is the historical background to the Enlightenment? Well, I think I made reference to it before when I was dealing with David Hume and John Locke and so on. The works of Isaac Newton were significant. The works of Isaac Newton clearly convinced Western society that we now, for the first time, had an understanding of how nature works, how the natural world works, what are the fundamental laws governing the natural world. No longer was there a need to resort to the concept of continuous divine interventions in the state of affairs that people witness around them, because everything, it was felt, could now be explained in purely naturalistic terms. It's the age of naturalism, right? And nature was founded or grounded on the establishment or the existence of fundamental laws. The response of the church to that clearly was that those were the laws of God. God had inserted his laws into the operations of the natural world. The church did not reject that Newtonian system. There were a few philosophers here and there who questioned it, but the church itself did not reject the Newtonian system, but saw that system in keeping with their understanding of where Newton himself was quite a devout Christian. If you look at the writings, the religious writings of Newton, Newton was extremely fundamentalist and a very literalist, and had a very literalist understanding of the Bible. So Newton's works had radically transformed the way in which people began to understand reality, the way in which they began to think. And Newton's thoughts spread very much throughout Western Europe, together with the ideas of John Locke. John Locke, the significance of John Locke was not necessarily merely his emphasis on the empirical method and accordingly the scientific method, but with respect to Locke, the political ideas, the development of the philosophy of human rights, and so on. And to a large extent, the Enlightenment was a very much European phenomenon. But there were a number of other things that were happening in the Western world that contributed significantly to the radical change in the political, social, and cultural circumstances of Western Europeans, right? Britain had not only provided the world with a scientific revolution, when it was jointly Britain and Europe. Remember that it started all with people like Galileo, Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo Galilei, and then Isaac Newton came and pulled everything together, reestablished, corroborated, right, the findings of his predecessors in the field of the sciences. But there was also the Industrial Revolution that took place, and the Industrial Revolution also had its birthplace in Britain. And it is not so much the scientists that were responsible for the Industrial Revolution. It was the technical classes, people who were producing things, making machines. Britain produced a number of, the British produced a number of new machines that facilitated the production of goods. And in mechanizing the production of commodities, what was happening was that prices were falling, right? The cost of production was becoming less. More people could afford many of the luxuries. It was really, in a way, a continuation of a revolution that started with the invention of the printing press. The printing press was a Germanic invention with its origins in China. The Industrial Revolution in Britain was one in which the British were producing radically new machinery. The spinning jenny, for example, which was very important in the weaving of cloth, and Britain now is producing cloth, in quantities that surpass that of any other European country, and was now beginning to look for markets. Last year I talked about Adam Smith as an associate of David Hume, and the man who brought his moral philosophical thinking into the area of economics and began to argue for markets for British products. And then there was a tremendous invention of the steam engine. The steam engine had been invented in a way in Alexandria in Egypt, in the early Greco-Roman civilization, sometime in the 3rd century, but it was merely used for toy making. When the British invented the steam engine, it meant that there could be a reduction of our dependence on actual human labor and animal labor, because very many of the mills and so on were worked by animals. Some of the mills were worked by water wheels and so on. And now, with the production of the steam engine, coal was mined in Britain, iron was mined in Britain, so you could make machines out of iron. You could use the coal to heat water, and the heated water, in its attempt to escape its confinement in some mechanism, would generate energies that surpass anything that was conceivable before. So Britain produced the train, and the train radically altered living conditions for people in all parts of the world. In fact, it was a train that eventually opened up the continent of North America and later carried to places like India, Africa, South and Latin America, South and Central America, right? The train was a very important instrument in the opening up of a known territory. Steamships, right? No longer did ships have to depend on the wind, sailing vessels, nor on rowers. because remember in ancient times, ships traversed the oceans with a number of rowers who actually, in most instances, slaves. And then wind power took over, and now the steam engine could be used to power steamships, no longer a dependence on air currents, which was very often so unreliable. The world was transformed by the British Industrial Revolution. Thinking had radically changed. Many of the old authoritarian systems of thought were now discarded. The notion of the divine right of kings, people like Hobbes and Locke and so on, and undermine those concepts that kings have no divine right to rule, that essentially there's a contract between the king and his subjects, and that determines the legitimacy of his rule. In fact, people were now questioning whether we should have kings at all, because remember that kings belong to a dynasty, they are born into kingship, and there is something that smacks of injustice and irrationality in that system. So a number of authoritarian systems were now rejected and discarded. People for the first time, and I mentioned it in the case of David Hume, began to attack the church and attack the church with impunity. That was inconceivable before. Nobody really attacked the church in the Middle Ages. What people attacked the church as an establishment, but from within the boundaries of Christian orthodoxy or Christian theology. They may have been very unorthodox, but within the boundaries of Christian theology, the church as an institution may have been attacked. But now, for the first time, Christianity itself was attacked, its system of ideas, its orthodoxies, and so on. The age became an age that now was characterized by what we call secularity, the birth of a secular society. And so that led to the famous French Revolution and the Napoleonic era. In the French Revolution, and you will know that from your study of history, the king was deposed and executed. The masses now took to the streets. They clamored for a democratic government, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. There's a sense in which a few years before, the Americans had achieved it in their revolt against the British imperial government. And now these ideas spread to the rest of Europe. The Americans had established a republic. That seemed to be the ideal form of government, a government in which represented the people and which could be removed at any time by the people. And there were a number of great French thinkers who contributed to that. People like Diderot and Montesquieu, right? These were men who were writing now on political matters. They were developing the concept of human rights well beyond where Locke and others had brought it to. The notion of modern democracy, which Napoleon, through the wars of the revolution and his invasion of other European countries, was now carrying to the rest of Europe. The Napoleonic era is a very significant era in human history because Napoleon was invading European countries, deposing their monarchs, and instituting a new kind of political arrangement which allowed people to participate. Education was brought to the masses and so on. So essentially, the Enlightenment period was a remarkable time. And the philosophers contributed significantly, right, to that change in human consciousness, those radically new ideas that were at the root of the social movements and the political developments which were taking place in Europe. I want to talk this evening about two of those great thinkers. And I will begin with the Frenchman, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau's contribution to Western European philosophy and thought was a very significant one. Right? Rousseau had written a book called The Social Contract. And it's interesting to look at Rousseau's argument in The Social Contract. He revisits a number of the notions that Hobbes would have brought into philosophical discourse. Right? Rousseau, the notion of man in a state of nature. There was a sense that if you're going to discuss human being and human existence, you have to revert to the foundations of that. And the foundations of that were now sought in man in a state of nature. Former times, one would have gone back to the story of Adam and Eve, right? And the biblical account of the origin of human society. Now, people in a more secularized environment were no longer prepared to accept that story as explaining man in his fundamental human nature. And you have to go back, as I think I said before, to man in the world of the hunter-gatherer. Right? Man in that state of nature, Hobbes had said, was a horrible creature, almost like an animal. And he had to bring order and decorum to his existence only through government. And Hobbes had recommended a very strong form of centralized government in the monarch, in the king, Leviathan. Rousseau totally rejects that. In fact, Rousseau sees man in his original condition as quite a great and noble creature. And he argues that it is civilization that contaminates human life and human society and human culture. Right? Rousseau was arguing that in a state of nature, man is born free. He makes the very famous statement, man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. Right? And what that did was that it established a very powerful philosophical foundation for the concept of human rights and human freedom. We are born free. God has made us free, as it were. And now we find ourselves oppressed by all kinds of systems, authoritarian systems, political and intellectual and economic and social and religious, all kinds of systems put us in chains. And what we need to do is to restore that freedom. Now, a lot of that notion that man in a state of nature is free derived from the Europeans' experience of the North American civilizations, native civilizations. There was something extremely appealing about the civilizations of North America, the Roman Indians and the plains. And what seemed to have emerged from that picture is the sense of man in his original state as a noble savage. That became a frequently used term that Rousseau himself had brought into philosophical discourse, the notion of the noble savage taken from the experience of North American societies, the Apaches and the Sioux and so on, people who lived a noble life, fighting wars on horseback and so on, and yet were savages, right? Their civilization cannot be characterized as highly scientific or civilized or cultural and so on. They lived in very rude circumstances, and yet there was a nobility about their existence. So the concept of the noble savage became a kind of watchword, right? It seemed to embody and embrace and personify, right, precisely what European civilization wanted to restore to the experience of being human. And so Rousseau, in the social contract, talked about that fundamental contract between the individual and the ruling class. But his argument was that we need to establish not monarchy like the Hobbesian paradigm, but what we need to do is to allow the masses, the people themselves, to make decisions as to who must rule them. And the institutions that are established must be institutions established on the basis of that human contract. Rousseau talked about the general will. That is important because it became so very important for democracy. Rousseau's general will, right? And general will normally is written with capital letter, general, capital G, and general, and will, capital W. The general will, and we'll see how that concept developed in later philosophers during the Enlightenment period, is suggestive of what we call the vox populi, the voice of the people. Very often people say the voice of the people is the voice of God. What is the voice of the people? Common understandings and common consensus among the people is what he refers to as the general will. And it is that general will which must be understood in the first instance and which must be followed, and followed in terms of the establishment of mechanisms or institutions of governance. So we must listen to that general will. And governments must not only advocate the general will and articulate it, but seek to advance it in the development of human civilization. So Rousseau's notion of the general will was an important one, and it served as a philosophical base for the concept of democracy, liberal democracy. Freedom, he established the importance of freedom on the one hand, and on the other hand, the need to have the people govern. Democracy comes from a Greek word, demos, meaning people, krasi, meaning government. So government of the people, by the people, and for the people is what Rousseau advocated. Now, Rousseau is considered to be one of the authors of the French Revolution. But he is also acknowledged as one of the great thinkers who was responsible for initiating what we call the age of Romanticism. Now, we're not going to be discussing too much about Romanticism in the course on philosophy, but for students of literature, those of you who would have been into the arts and humanities would know that the 18th century very often is referred to as the century of Romanticism. A lot of the literature before was extremely classical literature. It was a literature in which you celebrated the ancient heroes, war heroes, and sometimes even gods and goddesses and so on. The values were fairly heroic values also that were articulated within the classical system. Nobility, courage, and so on was celebrated. One of the interesting things about Rousseau is that Rousseau radically changed in a book that he wrote called The Confessions. It's really an autobiography. He radically changed our understanding of human feeling. In the Christian philosophical and theological tradition, feeling was a negative factor in human decision making. Man was a rational animal, Aristotle had said. That was accepted to a large extent even during the Middle Ages and now in the early Renaissance period. But one of the problems that man faced was the problem of feeling, sensation. And the problem of feeling was one in which the reason or rational faculties had to govern those unruly feelings, that feelings ought to be suppressed and so on, that we should not seek to articulate feelings. The notion of the inferiority of women was based large partly on the concept that they were creatures of feelings, the ease with which they cried and so on, their sense of compassion and so on. They were really people who were creatures of feeling, and men were creatures of reason. And in the Confession, what Rousseau was doing was celebrating feelings. Feelings were positive. Human feelings, even things like fear, had its functional value, right? That human beings were creatures both of feelings and reason. And what we needed to do is to recognize and acknowledge the value of both as we develop human civilization and as we produce artistic works. And so many of the great artists of this period were people who were prepared to articulate their feelings. When you read the writings of the Romantic authors, especially the Romantic poets, the British Romanticists, the French and the German Romanticists, they are people who are celebrating the realm of feeling. And it was a period during which men were not prepared to hide their feelings and not cry. They were prepared to express themselves and cry even as a woman would cry. Feelings now became a positive thing, and that became the basis of the Romantic movement. And it clearly was an anti-rationalist kind of spirit that was nurtured and that was advocated. And so you find in the literature a tendency to argue against the rules, against systems that regulated human existence too rigorously. What was encouraged was the expression of feeling in painting and in poetry and in music and so on. And you had some very famous authors, and for example, nature was celebrated. Nature was always seen as a dark side of human existence. Man had to create culture over against nature. Now, nature was celebrated, and you have a number of the great English painters like John Constable and so on, who was celebrating nature in their paintings. And people, in France and these places, who were celebrating feeling and so on in their paintings, as well as nature. So that whole period of Romanticism was a very significant period. And so that constitutes the nature of the Enlightenment period. The birth of the Industrial Revolution, the age of science and the age of reason, the attack on authority and monarchy, and so on. And the writings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau contributing significantly to it. And so Jean-Jacques Rousseau is seen as one of the men who was responsible for the outbreak of the French Revolution. He also wrote literature that had a very significant impact on education. Right? He's also in line with John Locke, was arguing for education as linked to play, made a very pleasurable experience. And he wrote a book called Emile, a novel called Emile, and another book on education, in which he advocated the education of the whole person, including his feelings and so on, not just his reason, his rational faculty, but the whole range of feelings that must be cultivated. And the individual should therefore be prepared for his role as a citizen in a modern secular society. His discourse on inequality was also very important. In fact, he was saying that people are, as I made the reference before, everywhere man is in chains, even though he's born free. We are all equal. We are born equal. That notion of being born equal was a very significant one. And it became actually one of the watchwords of the French Revolution. In the French Revolution, the watchwords were liberty, fraternity, equality, or death. And very often the death meant not the death of the self who did not enjoy it, but the death of those who were preventing us from achieving a state of affairs characterized by these three great watchwords: liberty, equality, right, and fraternity. The next great thinker in that era is regarded as the greatest philosopher of modern times. And so we'll spend the rest of the session discussing his philosophy. His philosophy is a very interesting one, and it still continues to impact a lot of contemporary thinking in today's world. In addition to that, churchmen were very happy for his philosophy, because once more, theologians and Christian philosophers thought that they found a very powerful rationalistic ground for its things like Christian morality and the concept of God and so on. And so Immanuel Kant is still regarded as the greatest philosopher of modern times. Right? He surpassed people like Descartes and so on, and even in the present day, a number of contemporary writers, contemporary philosophical thinkers are still reliant on the writings of Immanuel Kant. Now, Kant had a very simple life, and when you read the literature, you would realize that, you know, he lived in almost one city for most of his life, went to Prussia and so on. He lived very often as a private citizen, although he was involved in academic affairs eventually. He came into philosophy very late, and in fact, he says that the man who awakened him from his philosophical slumbers was David Hume. When he read the writings of Hume, immediately he was galvanized, as it were, into the area of deep philosophical thinking. And his writings really, in a way, is not only a response to Hume, but an attempt to resolve many of the fundamental ontological and epistemological problems that Hume had created. When we talk about Immanuel Kant, very often people refer to him as responsible for what was called the transcendental turn in philosophy. His philosophy was an idealistic philosophy. Again, not like Berkeleyan idealism, but it was an idealistic philosophy, but a philosophy of transcendentalism. And I'm using that word very cautiously because it could easily be confused with transcendent. Transcendental, as I will explain, is not the same as transcendent. And when I explain his philosophy, you'd understand the difference between the transcendental and the transcendent. Now, he wrote a book called The Critique of Pure Reason, one of the most famous books in all philosophical writing. And he said some things there that were very, very significant. First of all, you couldn't reject the point that Hume had arrived at epistemologically. And that is that if our knowledge, right, that only consists of the data that our minds receive from the external world, and there are no guarantees that that data or that our minds are constructed in such a way as to know the external world, then we're not sure that what we call knowledge is really knowledge of the external world. We're not sure of that. And that led Hume to skepticism. And that was the path that Kant was not prepared to take. Kant was not prepared to take the path of skepticism. But he found the Humean position to bring us to an impasse, which was virtually unresolvable. And he attempted to resolve it in a very peculiar way. What Hume did in The Critique of Pure Reason is that he establishes a clear difference between things in themselves and things as we perceive them. The things in themselves he called noumena, from the word noumenon, and the things that we perceive he called phenomena, from or phenomenon, the singular phenomenon. Now, on what he was saying was that things in themselves are inaccessible to human knowledge. We cannot know things in themselves. There's no way that we can arrive at an understanding of things in themselves. Now, it's not a view that is so wholly accepted today. Philosophically, yes, in a sense, but scientists work on a radically different assumption that we can investigate reality, that even though our senses are limited, we can create instrumentation that can assist us in understanding and in investigating the nature of being itself, the nature of things in themselves, and arrive at a knowledge and understanding that is very reasonable and accurate and authentic. But to a large extent, what Hume was saying was that those things in themselves are unknowable. When we look at a table, we look at a chair and so on, we can't tell what it really consists of. Remember the scientific revolution that was taking place, really, as I indicated before, especially as a result of the influence of men like Newton and others, began to reinstate the atomic theory of matter and so on. And nobody had seen an atom, nobody could develop instruments to perceive what an atom is really like. But there's a sense in which, yes, there is a scientific basis for the notion that things in themselves are unknowable. But Hume is saying that what happens is that the human mind comes, right, and confronts that objective external world. And in confronting that objective and external world, what the human mind does is that it imposes its own categories of thinking on that external world. There are forms of perception and there are categories of the understanding that we utilize in interpreting the data that we get from the external world. And ultimately, therefore, knowledge is a synthesis between the data that we receive through our perceptual mechanisms on the one hand, and the reformulation, the restructuring, right, through the categories of our understanding and the forms of our perception of that data, which constitutes is eventually what we consider to be knowledge. Knowledge is therefore a synthesis. It is partially constructed by the human mind, but not constructed independently of the external world and perceptions that we receive of states of affairs and entities that exist in that external world. Now, that continues to be a dominant notion in contemporary epistemological thinking. And it has gone into different pathways, and we will trace some of those pathways later on when we come to modern philosophical thought. But it is a very significant concept, and what it did is that it laid the foundations of what came to be called constructivism. And people who are into education would be very much acquainted with the notion of constructivism, that knowledge is constructed. That when you are teaching children, you're not only teaching them to perceive things in the external world, but to construct knowledge, right? That they have, the mind plays a very active part in what eventually constitutes our knowledge of objective reality. And so the system of Immanuel Kant, as articulated in the Critique of Pure Reason, was really one in which Kant tried to reformulate, recast, restructure our whole understanding of epistemology, and make us realize what a very active role we have to play in what eventually constitutes the formation of knowledge in our minds. Kant comes up with a very interesting conclusion about space and time. They are categories of, they are forms of perception. And he says, if every time you look at something, you see it in temporal terms and in spatial terms, it must occupy a position in space, and it must exist at a certain point in time. Then it may well be, he is saying, and in fact he's saying that it is the case, that space and time are categories of the mind. They're structures of mind that we impose on reality, that reality may not have anything like space and time. Now we can go back to the organon, Aristotle's organon, and his establishment of the 10 categories. Remember the 10 categories: substance and relation and space and time and so on, and position. He had established the 10 categories, but those 10 categories characterize the objective external world. So space and time belong to the external world. And when you get to a man like Augustine, Augustine speaks about God as the creator of space, creates a universe, which is space. And in the creation of the universe, he also creates time. He exists in eternity, but time is created with the universe. That's the Augustinian position. These are all external to human mind, human being. And they must, and in fact, man is located within space and time also. Kantian revolution, and Kant referred to his system as a Copernican revolution in philosophy. And Kant sees space and time as categories of the understanding that we impose on the external world, among other things. And Kant talks about, in fact, Kant comes up with 12 different categories that the mind imposes on the external world. And in the notes, I have listed those categories. Quantity, which deals with plurality, unity, and totality. Or quality, which deals with reality, negation, and limitation. Or relation, which deals with substance and accident, or cause and effect, or reciprocity. And modality, which deals with existence, possibility, and necessity. Now, perhaps when we have our discussion, we can examine some of these concepts in a little more detail, but these are the categories, the 12 categories of the understanding that Kant identifies and argues that these are categories that we impose on the external world. In the external world, there may not be anything like quantity or quality or relation or modality. Modality refers to forms of existence. Something may exist or it may not exist. If it does not exist, it may exist as possibility, or it may constitute a necessary existence, and not just a contingent existence, right? These are modalities of being. Our knowledge, he says, is a synthesis between the data of the senses, which he refers to as sensibility, and these internal subjective categories of understanding and perception. And this is what Kant refers to as a transcendental aesthetic, the transcendental turn in philosophy, right? A system of transcendental idealism, right? What transcendental idealism argues is that there is a sense in which we can never get to things in themselves. Remember the transcendent is that which is beyond existence. And the word has always been used in reference to heavenly things, the divine, God, right? The supra-terrestrial, and so on, the transcendent, right? We don't understand transcendence, and that's why transcendence, we have no avenues to our knowledge of transcendence, and that is the reason why revelation becomes so significant and faith is important, because we only get intimations of the transcendent through revelation. This is not what Kant is talking about. Kant is talking about the transcendental, right? That which transcends human perception, that which cannot be known, that which exists as noumena, or things in themselves in the external world. And that's essentially the transcendental turn in philosophy. And he's saying that a lot of our knowledge, now what Kant was actually doing in the critique of reason, of pure reason, was that he was bringing together rationalism and empiricism. Remember that there was that radical split between them in the early modern period, between the British empiricists and the European rationalists. And Kant was trying to fuse, to synthesize, to bring together those systems of thought. There was merit in both, and therefore they should not stand apart and be in permanent conflict with each other. That essentially what we need to do is to establish a system of ideas which reconciles the results of empiricism and the results of rationalism. And so he sees a place for both logical ideas and contingent ideas, logical truths and contingent truths. Remember, the empiricist deals with contingent truths, truths that exist, but you can't rationalize them, you just perceive them. And rational ideas that you can work out through the use of the Aristotelian syllogism, through the use of rational and logical thinking and mathematical thinking, right? So you have contingent versus logical and necessary truths. And then you also have a priori. Those are the truths of reason, the truths that come before any experience of the external world, logical, as against a posteriori truths. I made reference to that earlier, I think when we're dealing with Leibniz or Spinoza. So you have the a posteriori, he brings them together. And in fact, one of the great challenges that he faces and he seeks to resolve in the critique of pure reason is the problem of synthetic a priori truths or judgments, like the judgments or the truths of mathematics and many of the sciences. He is saying that they are both synthetic on the one hand, and that's another distinction. A synthetic truth and an analytical truth are also fit that dichotomy. A synthetic truth would be an a posteriori truth, and an analytic truth would be an a priori truth, the truths of reason, the truths that do not depend on experience, right? They would be analytic, and the truths of experience, the truths that we have of the external world, would be considered as synthetic truths. And what he was trying to do was to see how in mathematics, both of them actually come together. He refers to them as synthetic a priori truths or a priori judgments. The Kantian system, therefore, attempted to explain the nature of in this book, The Critique of Pure Reason, attempted to explain the nature of scientific knowledge. But then Kant had to deal with another problem that was derived from Hume, and that's the problem of Hume's fork. the radical dichotomization of fact and value. There is no relationship, you may say, between fact and value. And it's interesting to see how Kant attempts to reconcile that. Kant acknowledges that there's a fundamental distinction, but he creates a new kind of rationality for the area of value. And therefore, his other great work is a work called The Critique of Practical Reason. Right? That followed the Critique of Pure Reason. The Critique of Pure Reason deals with epistemology, and it deals essentially with issues of science and mathematics and so on, and epistemology. But the Critique of Practical Reason deals with values to a large extent. And in this book, right, he seems to resolve Hume's fork, or what is referred to as the is-ought dichotomy, or the fact-value dichotomy. He says that practical reason is a reason that issues in ethics, in values, in axiology. This is the reason that explains, right, what is not descriptive, but what is normative. So you have on the one hand the descriptive account of reality that you get in the Critique of Pure Reason, and now you have a normative account of reality, and this is a radically different reason. And what Kant had in the Critique of Pure Reason shown, he had destroyed the ontological argument in the Critique of Pure Reason. He had shown, for example, that the ontological argument makes no sense on the basis of the concept that existence, right, is not an attribute of being. You know, they remember the whole ontological argument that God must be the most perfect being, and that perfect being must include existence. You say, no, no, no. A perfect being is merely a thought of the mind. It doesn't have to include existence. So he totally destroyed the ontological argument. I don't think anybody really seriously advances the ontological argument after Immanuel Kant destroyed it. Although you will still see some theologians who will resort to it at times, right? But the ontological argument was, in the Critique of Practical Reason, what Kant is saying here is something very interesting. And he's saying it is in that critique that we have new forms of intuition. Just as we have categories of the understanding and forms of perception in pure reason, in practical reason, we have fundamental forms of intuition. And those forms of intuition include the notion of God, the notion of the immortality of the soul, and the notion of human freedom. So there's something that comes from within that registers and authenticates our concept of God, our concept of the soul, and our concept of human freedom. Without these concepts, Hume is saying, actually ethics becomes virtually impossible. But Kant develops a very, very interesting theory of ethics, and that theory of ethics still continues to hold to the present day. He enunciated something that he called the categorical imperative as the basis of ethical thinking, the basis of moral values. And the categorical imperative is an imperative which insists that no action is morally acceptable unless it is universalizable. If I can universalize an action, then it is only on that basis that the action can become morally acceptable. Now, it really is a philosophization, if you wish, or a philosophical version of the golden rule enunciated by Christ. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But he is expanding the base, right? He's given it a more philosophical articulation. And he is saying that unless it can be universalized, it can stealing be justified? And he's saying, yes, you can justify stealing. I need something and I can't get it, and you're not giving it to me and I steal it. You could argue that, but you can't, it cannot become a moral value. You cannot make stealing a moral value because you cannot universalize it. When you become the victim of stealing, then clearly you establish a boundary, a limitation. You say no to it. And so the notion of the categorical imperative insists that you can determine the morality, right, or the ethical worth and value of a fundamental position, thought, idea, instruction, imperative, only if it can be universalized. So very interesting in the Kantian system is that notion of the categorical imperative. But more than that, he creates a new kind of ethics, which he calls deontological ethics. An ethics that is not based on an examination of the way in which the world is organized. It's not based. Ontology deals with how the world is. Deontology is the opposite. It is not based on that. It is based purely on duty. It is an ethics of duty. I do something because it is my duty to do it. That's deontological. And he argues, therefore, that all moral action ought to issue from that sense of moral obligation. That's an imperative force, an unconditional imperative force that issues right out of the human practical reason. And he talks about the fundamental worth and dignity of man. He takes that notion of human being and human dignity beyond the point to which Rousseau had brought it, or Locke and the British empiricists had brought it. Man's dignity calls for moral action on the part of the individual. No human being should be used as an end, as a means to an end. Once you use a human being as a means to an end, then you're involved in immoral or unethical behavior. Every human being is a means to an end, right? Every human being is an end in himself, and each human being must be treated as an end in himself. And that's a radically new notion, and that is a notion that came to provide a basis for the rise of European humanitarianism. Now, humanitarianism was a very important concept. After Kant said something like that, clearly institutions like exploitation, economic exploitation, or slavery, or feudalism, and so on would be put into question, right? Because in these systems, human beings are using other human beings as means to an end to become rich. We could still make that description of modern capitalism, but nobody does that today. But the point about it is that a human being must be seen as an end in himself. And that really undermines concepts of justification for slavery. That Aristotle had serious moral problems with slavery, but he had to conclude in the end that slavery was a moral necessity, right? It was a necessary evil, he called it. Necessary evil. Now, Kant is undermining the foundations of what seemed to be a necessary evil. And he is saying that no human being must be treated, right, as anything but an end in himself. We must recognize the worth and the dignity of the human being. So Kant's contribution to moral philosophy, to ethics, was a tremendous contribution. And the church cashed into it very easily. The church recognized the value of that kind of thinking, and notions of duty and moral obligation, and the inherent concept of God and the immortality of the soul, and so on. He's pointing out that there really is no point in moral behavior unless you believe that the soul is immortal, and that human beings will be punished right after death. Unless you believe that there's a God who is over all seeing and overruling, and who really is going to determine human destiny on the basis of what we have done in this world, right? And then the whole notion of human freedom is central to the moral sphere. If you're not free, you can't impose ethical demands or responsibilities on human beings. Ethics implies the freedom of the individual. The individual is free to make decisions for himself and has to take responsibility, right, for those decisions. In the case of a religious system or regime, then he becomes accountable to God for his moral behavior. And so the Kantian system, right, is a Kantian ethical system, is certainly one that provided a powerful philosophical foundation for ethical thinking even up to the present time. And finally, when we're dealing with Kant, Kant wrote another book called The Critique of Judgment, and a very interesting book called The Metaphysics of Morals. The Critique of Judgment, he's dealing with values, moral values, as well as aesthetic values, concept of judgment, the third category of value. Aesthetics, the realm of the beautiful on the one hand, right, and ethics, the realm of the good and the just. But he makes in the metaphysics of morals a very interesting distinction, metaphysical distinction between justice and virtue. Now, justice is a virtue, but what he is saying is that in terms of justice, Governments have a responsibility to impose laws on a society, and that is where law comes in. Very often people talk about law and morality. They seem to be two sides of the same coin. But laws are enforceable by governments. So you have to be just to other human beings. You cannot just take a life or seize property, right? Or hurt another individual. The law steps in and the law adjudicates those issues. But in terms of virtue, that is up to human freedom. Whether you're compassionate, you're loving, and so on, nobody can enforce laws on you in that regard. That those are things that are performed by the free human agent who responds to the call of duty, who recognizes his moral obligation to others, and who is prepared to live a life that is fulfilling and a life that is worthwhile, both for himself, for his own benefit and happiness, and for other human beings. So Kant's contribution was a remarkable contribution. When we look at the philosophers who come after, we realize their tremendous indebtedness to Immanuel Kant. Kant is considered to be the greatest philosopher of modern times. And you can't do Western philosophy without at least some understanding of Kant's transcendental idealism, his philosophy of transcendental idealism. We stop there today.